In the autumn of 2011, a man named Leland Pendleton walked into the corporate offices of Precision Prefab LLC carrying a single envelope. It was thick, cream-colored paper stock, the kind you have to special order from a stationery supplier 3 counties over. His name was written on the return address in a steady architectural hand. Inside the envelope was one sheet of paper printed from a dot matrix machine, so old that the ink had that faint, ghostly quality of something that remembered when documents meant something. The invoice had a single line item: storage, sorting, and curation of raw materials, November 2000 through October 2011, and then the number $47,281.50. Opal Steck, the accounts payable clerk, who had been with the company 3 years, held the paper at arm's length as though it might be contagious. She brought it to Barnwell Mercer, the regional operations manager, who read it once, read it again, and then laughed. Not a polite laugh, a sharp, short bark of genuine disbelief. He should not have laughed. To understand the invoice and the long silence that followed that laughter, you have to understand the fence and the 11 years that preceded it. You have to understand a piece of land, a philosophy passed down through 3 generations of working men, and one quiet morning in November of the year 2000, when a 61-year-old cabinet maker asked a shift foreman if he could have a scrap of wood for his stove. That is where the real story begins. The spring of 1999 came early to Millhaven, Tennessee. The redbuds bloomed before the last frost had fully quit the hills, and the ground crews from the industrial park development broke earth on the eastern edge of town, while the blossoms were still on the branch. They came with equipment the town had not seen in that number before. Bulldozers and graders and compactors, heavy machines that made the windows rattle in the older buildings along Route 9. They worked 6 days a week. Lot 7 was a 14.6-acre parcel of graded compacted earth on which Precision Prefab LLC intended to construct an 80,000-square-foot facility for the manufacture of engineered wood products. Trusses, beams, I-joists, structural panels. The kind of precision-cut lumber components that went into subdivisions in commercial buildings from Nashville to Knoxville. On the other side of the property line was Leland Pendleton. The line itself had been unremarkable for 77 years. A row of wild cherry trees, some blackberry brambles, a low stone wall his grandfather had laid with rocks pulled from the creek so long ago that the mortar had turned to powder, and the stones stayed in place purely out of habit. It was a border between a small cabinet shop and an empty field, and nobody had paid it much attention since Calvin Coolidge was in office. The fence changed that: 1,240 feet of 4-foot chain link, which went up in a single week. Posts sunk in concrete galvanized wire stretched tight and fastened with aluminum ties. The crews were efficient. They worked without ceremony. When they finished, the western edge of Leland Pendleton's 3.2 acres had a new character entirely. It was hard now, industrial, the kind of edge that announced without apology that something serious was happening on the other side. Leland watched them put it up from his workshop window. He was 61 years old that spring. He had taken over his father Hadley's cabinet shop when Hadley's hands had finally given out 12 years before, and he had run it ever since from the same building his grandfather had constructed in 1931, from lumber salvaged after the mill collapse of the prior decade. The shop smelled of linseed oil and sawdust, and the faint mineral sharpness of sharpening stones. The shelves along the back wall held 40 years of accumulated hardware coffee cans labeled in masking tape, their contents cataloged in the same precise architectural script that would one day appear on a billing document addressed to a corporation. Finishing nails 6D, brass hinges 1.5 inch, drawer pulls assorted. He was known in Millhaven for 2 things. The first was the quality of his joinery. His dovetail joints had a tightness that other woodworkers in the county privately acknowledged and publicly declined to compliment. He cut them by hand with a marking gauge and a Japanese pull saw, and they fit with a precision that required no glue to hold. He had once built a blanket chest for a woman on Sycamore Street that her granddaughter still used 40 years later, and the joints had not opened by 1/1000th of an inch. The second thing he was known for was that he never threw anything away. Not a bent nail, not a stripped screw, not a sliver of wood longer than his thumb. This was not the behavior of a man who had difficulty letting go of things. It was the behavior of a man who had been taught from the time he was old enough to hold a hammer that the category of waste did not exist in nature, only in the failure of human imagination. His father Hadley had taught him that. Hadley had learned it from his own father, who had built the original farmhouse and the outbuildings from timber salvaged after the flood of 1913, had taken the old gristmill and scattered its bones across 3 counties. When you built a house from lumber that the river had already tried to destroy, you developed a permanent and cellular understanding of what material was worth. The fence went up. Leland watched. He did not complain about the noise or the dust. He simply watched and he thought, and he waited to see what the factory would do next. He did not wait long. The night before the first fence post was driven, Cordelia Pendleton stood at the kitchen window and watched the survey stakes going in by flashlight. She had lived in this house for 31 years. The cherry trees along the western border had been there when she arrived, and she had watched them bloom every April without fail, and she had made preserves from their fruit when the crop was good, and she had not known until this moment how much she had counted on them being permanent. "Your father planted some of those trees," she said. She was speaking to Leland, who was sitting at the kitchen table with a woodworking journal open in front of him. "And you're just sitting here." Leland did not lower the journal immediately. He read to the end of the paragraph he was on. Then he set the journal on the table face down to mark his place, and he stood and walked to the window and stood beside his wife and looked out at the stakes and the lights. He did not say anything. Cordelia had been married to him long enough to understand the difference between his silences. There was the silence of a man who had nothing to say, and there was the silence of a man who was measuring. This was the second kind. She recognized it the way you recognize weather. She did not ask him what he was measuring. He went to bed at his usual time. In the morning before the crews arrived, he walked the length of the property line from north to south, his boots leaving tracks in the dew on the grass. He moved slowly, stopping every 20 feet or so. He was not mourning the cherry trees. He was establishing angles. From the northwest corner of his lot, if you stood at a specific point near the old stone wall, you had an unobstructed view of what would become the loading and disposal area on the eastern end of Lot 7. Leland made a note of that in his mind and went inside for breakfast. The factory went up fast, steel frame first, then the corrugated metal skin, then the loading docks on the eastern face, 3 of them, with the mechanical doors and the concrete aprons. The machinery arrived in pieces on flatbed trucks over the course of 6 weeks, computer-controlled saws the size of small houses, hydraulic presses, climate-controlled drying rooms. The building was immaculate in its design, a marvel of modern industrial efficiency. It was the kind of operation that could take in a shipment of kiln-dried Douglas fir from a mill in Oregon and turn it into finished structural components within 48 hours with a cutting tolerance of 1/16 of an inch. That precision was its great strength. It was also the source of something Leland had been watching for from the northwest corner of his property since the loading docks first opened. The byproduct of cutting structural lumber to exact specification is offcuts. Pieces that are too short to use, ranging from 6 inches to sometimes 4 feet in length, cut away from 24-foot beams to meet a customer's order of 23 feet 7 inches. To a computer-controlled production system optimized for throughput, these pieces were categorically useless. Too short to re-enter the machine queue. Too varied in dimension to bundle for resale. On the balance sheet, they were logged as process-generated waste, and the company paid an industrial hauling firm $1,500 a month to take them to the county landfill. Every 2 days, a large yellow dumpster filled with those offcuts. Leland watched a piece of perfectly clear, kiln-dried 2x10 Douglas fir go into that dumpster. Then a length of laminated maple still smelling of the mill. Then sections of Baltic birch plywood, void-free, the kind that costs more per sheet than most furniture hardwoods. He watched it happen for the better part of a year before he did anything about it. He was not a man who acted before he understood a situation completely. When he finally understood it, he put on his canvas work coat and his father's leather gloves. The palms darkened with 40 years of oil and sweat, and he walked to the factory's loading dock on a Tuesday morning in November of 2000. The shift foreman that day was Merritt Pruitt. Merritt was 55 years old, had a bad knee from a football injury in 1963 that had never been properly repaired, and wore the expression of a man who had been doing a job for long enough that he no longer needed to think about it. He was watching a worker guide a bin of offcuts to the dumpster when Leland approached. Leland did not introduce himself. He pointed at a flawless 3-foot length of Douglas fir sitting on top of the pile. "Can I have that piece for my wood stove?" he asked. Merritt looked at him, looked at the dumpster, looked back at him. "Take what you want, old-timer," Merritt said. "It's all going to the landfill. Just don't get in front of the forklift." That was the agreement. It was never written down. It was never reviewed by a lawyer or entered into a system or assigned a tracking number. It was 20 words spoken between two men of a certain generation who understood without needing to discuss it that a handshake and a shared sense of practical reality were more binding than most documents. The next morning, Merritt told his forklift operator to stop making the trip to the main dumpster and simply tilt the off-cut bin over the fence at the back corner of the adjacent property. It was easier. It saved the company a marginal but measurable amount of dumpster space. It saved Leland Pendleton the trouble of asking for wood piece by piece. It was an elegant, unstated solution to a problem that both men understood without having to name it. The first time the forklift operator tipped a full bin of offcuts over the fence, Cordelia Pendleton was in the kitchen rolling out pie crust when she heard the sound. A deep, resonant boom followed by the cascading clatter of falling timber. She came out of the back door, fast, flowery hands, and all convinced something had collapsed. What she found was her husband standing at the fence line looking down at a cascade of pale and reddish wood scraps spread across 20 feet of her vegetable garden's margin. His expression was one she had seen before, usually when he found a particularly fine piece of walnut at an estate sale. Not happiness exactly. Recognition. "What on earth?" she said. "Material," he said. She looked at the wood. She looked at him. She went back inside and resumed the pie. Within a week, she was regretting that she had not said more. The deliveries came 2 or 3 times a week, and by December, the pile at the fence line had grown to a height that was visible from the county road. Cordelia received a call from a neighbor on the far side of the ridge who had driven past and wondered if everything was all right over at the Pendleton place. Cordelia thanked her and hung up, and that evening she sat down across from Leland at the kitchen table. "People are starting to talk," she said. "What are they saying?" "That we've become a junkyard." Leland set down his coffee. He stood and walked to the back door and opened it and waited. Cordelia followed him out into the cold air. He led her to the fence line and pointed. Not at the chaotic face of the pile, which admittedly looked from a distance like something that had fallen from a truck. He pointed to the rows he had already started building behind it. He had laid down a foundation of heavy timber sections to elevate everything off the damp ground. On top of those courses of boards and between each course, small, uniformly sized blocks of wood that held the layers apart and let the air move freely between them. This technique, called stickering, had been used by lumber yards and careful craftsmen for as long as men had understood that wood was a living material that needed to breathe. Kiln drying removed the gross moisture, but only time and air could bring a board to the stable equilibrium it needed before fine furniture work. Leland knew this the way he knew how to sharpen a plane iron, which was to say completely and without having to think about it. The stacks were already organized by species. The reddish grain of the Douglas fir in one section, the pale cream of the maple in another. A small stack of white oak that had shown up in 2 deliveries separated to one side because oak had its own requirements in its own timeline. Cordelia looked at the rows in the lamplight from the back porch. "It doesn't look like a junkyard," she said after a moment. "No," Leland said. She was not fully convinced, but she stopped raising the subject, which was in the language of their particular marriage, a form of approval. In a small notebook with a dark blue cover and a leather binding he had stitched himself, Leland began recording the deliveries, the date, an estimate of the board footage based on his count of the pieces and their approximate dimensions. He used a pencil because he did not trust ink in a shop environment. The entries were brief and specific. November 14th, 2000, approximately 210 board feet, Douglas fir 2x10 and 2x8 mixed lengths, some plywood 3/4-inch partial sheets. He did not know when he started that notebook exactly what he was going to do with the numbers. He kept them because he was a man who believed that anything worth doing was worth measuring, and because his instinct honed over 6 decades told him that a record of something was always more valuable than the memory of it. That notebook and the careful penciled numbers inside it would wait 11 years for their purpose. In the spring of 2001, a man named Denholm Cartwright stopped by the workshop on a Tuesday afternoon. Cartwright was 58 years old and ran the largest cabinet shop in Millhaven, a proper operation with 3 full-time employees and a new delivery truck with the company name painted on the side in gold leaf. He had been in the woodworking business for 30 years and had built his reputation on production volume and competitive pricing, which was a different philosophy entirely from Leland's, but one that had served him well enough. He stopped by with the stated purpose of borrowing a specific router bit he said he did not have in his inventory. Leland found the bit and handed it over. Cartwright took it and stood at the workshop door and looked past Leland toward the fence line. The pile was substantial by now, stretching 40 feet along the fence and rising to a height of 8 feet at its tallest point. Even with the stickered rows behind it, the visible face of the accumulation looked to an uninformed eye exactly like what Cartwright chose to believe it was. "I heard you were collecting scrap from that factory," Cartwright said. His voice had the quality of a man delivering a verdict he had already reached. "You're not concerned. People will think this place is a salvage operation rather than a cabinet shop." Leland looked at him for a moment. "Thank you for stopping by, Denham," he said. Cartwright had the router bit. There was nothing left to negotiate. He left. Whitfield Pendleton, 11 years old, had been in the yard and had heard the exchange through the open workshop window. He came to the door after Cartwright's truck had pulled away. He was a serious-faced boy, and he had his grandmother's habit of asking direct questions without preamble. "Is Mr. Cartwright right?" he asked. "Cartwright sees what he wants to see," Leland said. "That's his limitation, not ours." Whitfield considered this. He was not entirely satisfied by it. He was at an age where the opinions of people outside the family carried a weight that felt disproportionate and unavoidable. And Denholm Cartwright was not the only person in Millhaven who had noticed the pile. The following year, Whitfield was 13. He had taken to routing his walk home from school along the back road, specifically to avoid passing the property from the front, where the pile was visible to anyone driving along the county road. One afternoon, he made the mistake of taking the shortcut through the yard with a friend. The friend stopped and stared at the fence line with his mouth slightly open. "Is your grandpa collecting trash?" he asked. Whitfield said nothing. He kept walking toward the house. That evening, he found Leland at the workbench planing a piece of cherry for a commission he was finishing. The workshop smelled of the wood sweet and faintly medicinal, the shavings curling up from the plane like small yellow ribbons. "Can you stop taking the wood from the factory?" Whitfield asked. He said it carefully, the way you say something you have been rehearsing. "People are talking." Leland set the plane down. He turned around and lowered himself to one knee so that he was at the boy's eye level. This was something he had done since Whitfield was very small, and Whitfield had always found it both comforting and faintly alarming because it meant the conversation was going to be serious. "Whitfield," he said, "people talk about things they don't understand. That has always been true, and it will always be true. It is not a reason to stop doing something that is right. But everyone can see it from the road. Let them see it." Whitfield opened his mouth to continue, and Leland held up one hand, not harshly, just firmly. "Are we going fishing on Saturday?" he asked. Whitfield blinked. "I guess." "Good. I'll have the lines ready." The subject was closed in the way that Leland closed subjects, which was quietly and completely without drama or residue. Whitfield went to bed that night, staring at the ceiling, turning the conversation over. What bothered him was not just the embarrassment, it was something harder to name. His grandfather had answered the question without answering the question, and Whitfield was old enough to know the difference, but not yet old enough to understand why someone would do that deliberately. He was beginning to suspect that his grandfather was always several moves ahead in a game that nobody else could see the board for. In 2003, Cordelia was diagnosed with severe rheumatoid arthritis in both hands. The inflammation had been building for years, but the formal diagnosis came in February after a winter that had been hard on her joints. The doctor in Millhaven told her to avoid heavy manual labor and suggested she find hobbies that did not stress the small bones of the fingers. Cordelia, who had kept a kitchen garden for 30 years, understood immediately what this meant for her spring planting. She did not tell Leland directly. She mentioned it at dinner practically as a medical fact rather than a complaint. He listened. He said he was sorry to hear it. He asked if she wanted more soup. 3 weeks later, without announcing his intention or asking her preference, he built a cold frame along the southern edge of her garden. He built it from cedar offcuts that had come over the fence, cedar being both rot-resistant and light enough for a person with compromised hands to manage. He designed it low to the ground with a hinged top panel weighted with a counterbalance so that it could be opened and closed with 2 fingers. He installed a short wooden lip around the base that doubled as a seat, so Cordelia could tend the seedlings inside without kneeling. He sanded the exterior until there were no rough edges anywhere. He painted it white because she had once mentioned years ago that she liked white garden structures. He said nothing when it was finished. He simply moved it into place and went back to the workshop. Cordelia found it the following morning when she went out with her coffee. She stood in front of it for a long time. She set her coffee mug on the wooden lip and placed both hands swollen and stiff at the knuckles flat on the top surface of the wood. It was smooth and warm from the early sun. She recognized the grain pattern of the cedar. She knew exactly where it had come from. She did not call out to him. She did not go to the workshop to thank him. She went back inside and made him a proper breakfast, which was a language they both understood. And that evening, when she set his coffee in front of him, she did not say a single word about the fence line. This was the moment, though neither of them would have used that word for it, when Cordelia Pendleton stopped being a skeptic and became something closer to a believer. She had not changed her opinion because, as he had argued with her, she had changed it because he had answered a need she had not asked him to answer using material she had publicly doubted, and the result was something she could put her hands on. That was the way he worked, not through persuasion, through demonstration. And quietly, without ceremony, in the small leather-bound notebook that sat on the shelf above his workbench, Leland Pendleton turned to a fresh page and entered the date and the quantity and the species, and he continued counting. The winter of 2004 into 2005 was the worst Tennessee had seen in 2 decades. It came early and stayed mean. By the second week of December, the ground along the fence line was frozen solid to a depth that made digging impossible. And by January, the off-cut pile had disappeared entirely under 3 feet of compacted snow and a shell of ice that formed when a freezing rain came through on a Tuesday night and sealed everything it touched. The neighbors who had been watching the pile with various degrees of disapproval now watched it with something closer to satisfaction. A man on the far side of Route 9 mentioned to his wife that it looked like the old Pendleton place was finally going to have to deal with that situation. An ice storm had accomplished what social pressure had not. Leland Pendleton was not dealing with it. He was waiting for the thaw. When it came in the last week of February, he was at the fence line before the ground had fully softened. Whitfield was 17 that year, and he came home from school on a Friday afternoon to find his grandfather already 3 hours into an inspection of the stickered rows moving along each stack, systematically pulling boards and examining them in the flat gray light, running his thumb along the grain sighting down the face of each piece for any sign of warping or separation. Whitfield watched from 20 feet away for a few minutes before he said anything. "Did the ice hurt it?" he asked. Leland held up a length of maple and turned it slowly. The surface was cold to the touch, still carrying winter in its fibers, but the face was clean. The grain was tight and unbroken. The stickering had kept the air moving between the layers even through the worst of the freeze, and the wood had come through without significant loss. "Not much," Leland said. He handed the maple board to Whitfield without further explanation. Whitfield took it. He turned it in his hands the way he had seen his grandfather do, though he was not yet sure what he was looking for. The board was heavy and solid, denser than he expected for something that had been sitting outside in the weather for 3 winters. He looked at the end grain, at the tight annual rings that marked the slow growth of a Douglas fir in the Pacific Northwest, rings so close together they were almost indistinguishable to the naked eye. "Grandpa," he said, "what could you make from something like this?" Leland stopped what he was doing. He looked at his grandson with an expression Whitfield could not quite read. "That board," he said, "tabletop, or a cabinet door, or something we haven't thought of yet." It was the first time Whitfield had asked a question about what the wood could become, rather than why it was there at all. Leland filed the moment the way he filed everything, quietly and without making a show of it. But he did not forget it. Whitfield helped without being asked for the rest of that afternoon. They did not discuss it. They simply worked, and when the light failed, they went inside, and Leland made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table in the particular silence that exists between people who have just done physical work together and have nothing they need to say about it. The pile had survived the worst winter in a generation. Every neighbor who had expected the ice to end the matter drove past in March and found it still there, larger than before, the stickered rows now clearly visible where the snow had pulled back. Denham Cartwright noticed from the road on his way to a job site in Cookville and kept his opinion to himself, which cost him something. By the summer of 2005, Leland had accumulated an estimated 10,000 board feet of prime lumber. He knew this because he had counted it methodically and repeatedly in the pages of the dark blue notebook. He also knew because he read trade publications and kept current on material prices that a commercial lumber supplier would charge somewhere in the neighborhood of $20,000 for that quantity and quality of wood. He had not spent a dollar of it. That summer, he decided the small shed where he air-dried his personal stock of walnut and black cherry was no longer serviceable. The roof had begun to fail. The floor joists were soft with age, and a colony of carpenter ants had established a population in the northeast corner that was beyond reasonable remediation. He drew the replacement on graph paper at the kitchen table over the course of 4 evenings, the same table where he had always done his planning work, the surface marked with the ghost rings of 1,000 coffee mugs. 12 feet by 24 feet, a gambrel roof to maximize usable space in the loft. Foundation of salvaged concrete blocks. Walls framed in 2 by 6 Douglas fir from the fence line rows. Sheathing from 3/4-inch plywood offcuts, squared and fitted together like puzzle pieces. Roof trusses built on the workshop floor using a framing square and a handsaw, the same engineering logic that precision prefab's computer-driven machines employed on the other side of the fence, executed by hand, with tools that predated the zip code system. It took all summer. Whitfield, 17 and increasingly ambivalent about the project, helped on weekends, mostly because he felt the pull of obligation rather than interest. One Saturday afternoon in August, sweating through his shirt in the heat, he said what he had been thinking since the foundation went in. "Why don't you just buy the lumber, Grandpa? You could have this thing built in 2 weeks." Leland was fitting a rafter into its seat cut. He did not stop working. "Faster is not the point," he said. "Better is the point." Whitfield knew better than to push further, but he spent the drive home that evening calculating in his head the hours his grandfather had put into the shed so far. The math was not flattering by any economic measure he had been taught. His business class at school that fall would confirm what his instincts already suspected. The rational actor allocates time to its highest valued use. His grandfather appeared to be unaware of this principle or willfully indifferent to it. What Whitfield had not yet developed the vocabulary to describe was the difference between optimizing a process and building a capability. He would learn that distinction, but not for a few years yet. The shed was finished in October. It was by any honest assessment overbuilt for its stated purpose. The joints were tight. The roof pitch was mathematically precise. The interior smelled of fresh pine and dry air, and when you walked on the floor, it did not flex. Leland moved his personal walnut and cherry stock into the loft and immediately began moving the best of the fence line wood inside out of the weather. The system formalized itself around the new structure without anyone declaring it a system. Wood came over the fence. Leland sorted it. The structurally compromised pieces went to the firewood stack, which stood 6 feet high and was cross-hatched like a professional cord. The clear usable stock went through its seasoning year outside. Then it moved indoors. The factory next door was producing material continuously, and Leland had built the means to receive it, store it, and give it time. The notebook filled up. He started a second one. In early 2006, Waverly Fitch showed up. Fitch was the building code inspector for the county, 52 years old, a careful and methodical man who had held the position for 14 years and who had known Leland since they were in the same Sunday school class in the 1970s. He came on a Wednesday morning with a clipboard and an expression that communicated his discomfort before he said a word. "Someone filed a complaint," he said. "I have to follow up." Leland looked at him steadily. "Come inside and look," he said. He walked Fitch through the shed in detail. Every beam labeled with the species and date of acquisition. Every connection point accessible and visible. The framing square corners. The load path from ridge to foundation, clean and logical. Fitch inspected for 40 minutes, taking notes. He checked the rafter tails. He checked the ledger connections. He checked the floor system. He found nothing that violated the residential building code. Before he left, he said quietly and without looking directly at Leland, "Next time you build something significant, file the permit application first. I don't enjoy these visits." Leland thanked him. He closed the door. He stood in the shed for a moment in the quiet, and then he opened the drawer in his workbench and took out a new notebook, smaller than the board-foot log, and he began to write the date, the structure, the materials, the inspection result. He would keep this record for every building project from that point forward. Documentation was a form of armor. He did not know yet how much he would need it. Cordelia's health declined through 2006. The arthritis had spread, and in the summer, a cardiologist in Nashville told her that her heart was not compensating well for the inflammation load and that she needed to reduce physical stress significantly. She was not a woman who received medical news badly. She received it practically, made the adjustments that were required, and continued. But the garden became harder, and the distances she could walk comfortably became shorter, and there was a quality to the afternoons now that had not been there before. Leland built a sitting area on the south side of the house, a low platform of smooth planed fir boards shaded by a roof of cedar shakes with a railing she could use to lower herself into the chair without strain, and a small table at the right height for a coffee cup. He installed it without telling her it was coming. One morning she came outside and it was there. She sat in it every afternoon that fall. From where she sat, she could see the fence line clearly, and she watched him work in the evenings the way she had watched him work for 38 years, from various windows and doorways, with the particular intimacy of a person who has memorized someone else's movements without meaning to. One evening in October, she called him over. "I don't think it's junk anymore," she said. He sat down in the chair beside her. "When did you change your mind?" She looked toward the cold frame at the edge of the garden, its white paint bright in the low autumn light. "When you built that," she said, "you didn't ask me what I wanted. You just knew and you used what you had, and it was exactly right." She paused. "That's not how a person thinks about junk." He did not say anything. He stayed beside her until the light went and the air turned cold, and then he helped her inside. Cordelia Pendleton died in February of 2007 on a Thursday from complications following a cardiac event that happened in her sleep. It was fast, the doctor said, and she would not have been aware of it. Leland received this information in the hospital corridor with the same stillness with which he received all information, and then he drove home and sat at the kitchen table and did not move for a very long time. He did not go to the workshop for 3 weeks. Whitfield, 18, and in his first semester at the community college, came home on weekends and found it difficult to know what to do with a version of his grandfather who did not work. The workshop was closed. The fence line went unattended. The deliveries from the factory still came, and the wood piled up unprocessed at the base of the fence, and nobody sorted it. On the 14th night after Cordelia's funeral, Whitfield woke at 2 in the morning to a sound from outside that he could not immediately identify. He went to his bedroom window and looked out. Leland was at the fence line. He had strung a work light from a post, a bare bulb on an extension cord, and in its yellow circle he was sorting wood. Alone in the middle of the night in February in the cold, moving slowly and without urgency, picking up each piece and examining it and placing it where it belonged. Not because anyone had asked him to, not because it needed to be done that particular night, because it was the thing he knew how to do and he was doing it, and in that motion there was something that was not grief exactly, but was grief's only available answer. Whitfield stood at the window for 10 minutes. He did not go outside. He understood, in the way that young people sometimes understand things before they have the words for them, that this was not a moment that wanted company. He went back to bed. In the morning he got up before Leland and started the coffee and had it ready when the old man came in. Nothing was said about the night. But from that weekend forward, Whitfield came home more frequently, and he began helping at the fence line without being asked, and the quality of his helping was different now, more attentive, less performative. He was no longer doing it out of obligation. He was doing it because he had seen something through a window at 2 in the morning that had changed the way he understood the project and the man. The barn started in the spring of 2008. The first shed was full. Not merely full, but organized to its maximum capacity, every cubic foot of usable space occupied by wood that had been seasoned and sorted and was ready to work. Leland had been drawing plans at the kitchen table at Cordelia's table for 2 winters. The barn would be 30 feet by 50 feet, a proper timber frame structure with a large central bay and 2 enclosed side wings. The frame would be built from 6 by 6 posts and 4 by 10 beams, all of it sourced from the fence line. He would need to buy metal roofing. Everything else would come from what he had. Whitfield, now 20, and studying business at the community college, came home for the summer and found the site staked and the materials sorted. He walked through the stacks of timber with his hands in his pockets and his mind doing arithmetic. He had been in enough accounting classes by then to run the numbers without a calculator. He knew the approximate board footage from the notebooks. He knew lumber prices from research projects he had done for class. He sat down that evening with a legal pad and a pencil and worked it out, and when he reached the end, he sat quietly for a moment with the pencil in his hand. He found Leland in the workshop. "Do you know what this wood would sell for on the open market?" Whitfield asked. "I have a sense of it," Leland said. He was at the workbench fitting a wooden mallet handle he was replacing on an old tool. "More than $40,000. That sounds about right. And you're going to put it in a barn." Leland set the mallet down. He picked up the plane iron from the bench and held it to the light to check the edge. "I'm going to build a barn with it," he said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Selling it gets you the value once. Building with it keeps producing value." He set the iron down. "You're confusing the lumber with the capability." Whitfield stood in the doorway. He was a smart young man and he knew it, and there were moments with his grandfather when his intelligence became a kind of obstacle, because the old man's logic was not the kind that responded to the tools Whitfield was learning to use. It was older than that. "You could be using these years to build a business," Whitfield said. "That," Leland said, picking up the mallet and resuming his work, "is exactly what I am doing." Whitfield left the workshop without another word. He spent that evening on the porch with his legal pad, and for the first time he tried to model what his grandfather was building in a way that made financial sense. He could not get the numbers to work within any framework he had been taught. But there was a figure in the back of his mind growing that he kept returning to and that he could not dismiss, which was the question of what this inventory would be worth if it were attached to a production capability rather than sitting in storage. He went to bed without solving it. The barn took 2 years. Leland worked on it in the mornings and evenings, fitting construction around cabinet commissions that paid the bills. Whitfield helped during summers and holiday breaks, and over those seasons, something changed between them that neither of them mentioned. Whitfield began to understand the sequencing of the work, the way each phase set up the next, the way Leland never moved to the next step until the current one was correct. He began to understand that this was not stubbornness. It was a discipline. In the fall of 2009, Merritt Pruitt retired from Precision Prefab after 31 years. There was a small party in the break room. The shift supervisor who replaced him was 29 years old and had come from a distribution center in Kentucky and had no particular knowledge of or interest in the arrangement at the back fence. The forklift operators had rotated twice since the original agreement. The practice continued because it was established practice, not because anyone still understood why it had started. This was the quiet vulnerability at the center of the 11-year arrangement, and Leland knew it. He had always known it. The deal was not durable because it was documented. It was durable only as long as the people who knew its origin were still present. When Merritt retired, Leland noted it the way a man notes a change in weather. He did not alter his behavior. He simply registered that something had shifted. The barn was finished in the spring of 2010. Whitfield came home for the completion weekend and helped Leland hang the last of the exterior siding. When they were done, they stood in the central bay and looked at the space around them. The side wings were already packed with organized wood. The central bay was clear, swept clean, lit by high windows on the south face. "What goes in here?" Whitfield asked. Leland looked at the space for a long moment. "Equipment," he said. Whitfield waited for more. More did not come. He had learned by then not to press. Over the following months, things began to appear in the barn. A table saw from a farm auction vintage with a 5-horsepower motor and a cast iron table that was still flat to within 1/1000th of an inch, purchased for $300. A jointer 24-inch capacity from a high school woodshop program that had been eliminated in a budget cut, acquired for $500 and worth $15,000 new. A bandsaw, a drill press, a dust collection system made from an industrial blower, and a 55-gallon drum engineered by Leland himself over the course of a winter weekend. He transported each piece on a borrowed trailer and moved it into position in the barn and began the work of restoration, tuning the machines to tolerances that their original manufacturers would have recognized with satisfaction. Whitfield noticed the machines accumulating during a visit in December. He stood in the barn doorway and counted them. He thought about the cleared central bay that now had a specific purpose. He thought about the wood in the side wings. He thought about the 2 years it had taken to build the barn and the 10 years it had taken to fill the storage buildings behind it. For the first time, he thought he might be beginning to understand the board. In the spring of 2011, Precision Prefab, LLC, was acquired by a national manufacturing conglomerate headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. The acquisition was reported in the Millhaven Courier in a 2-paragraph item on the business page. The plant manager who had overseen the facility since its opening, a man who had known about the fence arrangement in the general way that long-term managers know about established practices, announced his retirement. His replacement arrived on a Monday morning in April. Barnwell Mercer was 34 years old. He had an MBA from Penn State and a Six Sigma Black Belt certification and a professional identity built entirely on the science of operational efficiency. He was not a bad man. He was a specific kind of man, the kind whose mind converted every situation it encountered into a set of quantifiable variables and then ranked those variables by impact and addressed them in order. He was very good at this. It had taken him from an entry-level analyst position to a regional management role in 8 years, and he had every reason to believe it would take him further. He arrived at the Millhaven facility with a tablet computer and a stopwatch and began his operational review on day 1. By day 3, he had walked every square foot of the production floor, reviewed the last 5 years of disposal invoices, and identified 17 inefficiencies he intended to address in his first quarter. On the afternoon of day 3, he followed a forklift operator to the back of the facility to observe the waste disposal process. He watched the operator lift a bin of offcuts, carry it to the rear fence line, and tilt it over. "What is that?" Mercer asked. The shift supervisor shrugged. "Arrangement we have with the neighbor. He takes the scraps, keeps the area clear. Been doing it forever." Mercer did not respond. He was already opening a new document on his tablet. He spent that evening pulling records. Property tax records for the adjacent parcel. Satellite imagery from 3 different years. The disposal invoices, which showed a consistent $1,500 monthly charge to the hauling company. He looked at the image of the pile on the neighbor's property, and he saw a liability and an opportunity simultaneously, which was the way his mind had been trained to see things. The following Tuesday, he drove to the Pendleton property. He wore a pressed blue shirt and work boots that showed no evidence of actual work. Leland was at his bench when Mercer knocked on the workshop doorframe, sharpening the blade of a hand plane that was older than Mercer's parents. He continued working for a moment before he acknowledged the visitor. It was not rudeness. It was the habit of a man who did not interrupt work for anything that could wait. Mercer introduced himself and came to his point without preamble, which Leland respected, even if he did not find the point persuasive. The arrangement was undocumented and therefore legally problematic. The company was prepared to formalize it with a modest lease payment, $100 a month, in exchange for the right to continue staging material on the corner of the Pendleton property. All Leland would need to do was cash the checks. Leland set the plane down. "That wood isn't debris," he said. "It's lumber." Mercer's professional smile adjusted slightly. He explained patiently that from his company's accounting perspective, the material was categorized as waste. He was offering Leland $1,200 a year for a zero-effort arrangement. He used the phrase win-win, which Leland heard without reaction. "No," Leland said. The words sat in the air between them. Mercer was accustomed to negotiation. He was not accustomed to a single syllable that did not invite a response. He recalibrated. He explained the alternative. The arrangement would end in 30 days. The accumulated material on the Pendleton property was a potential violation of County Ordinance 114B, uncontrolled accumulation of solid waste. If it was not cleared by October 31st, the company would be obligated to notify the Code Enforcement Office. He was not threatening. He was stating the operational reality as he understood it. He was a man of systems, and this was how systems worked. Leland picked up the plane and tested the edge with his thumb. "You do what you need to do," he said. Mercer drove back to the facility and drafted the certified letter with the company's legal department. It went out the next morning. The 30-day clock started. Whitfield heard about the letter before Leland told him. The story had already reached 3 households in Millhaven by the time Whitfield came home from class. He walked in the back door and found his grandfather at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the hand plane's rosewood handle which he was refreshing with a light coat of linseed oil. Whitfield pulled out a chair and sat down. "Did you just let him do that?" he said. "$100 a month is money for nothing." "It wasn't for nothing," Leland said. "He was asking me to store his company's waste. I'm not a junkyard." "But it's not waste. It's what you've been using for 11 years. "Exactly," Leland said. Whitfield stared at him. "That doesn't make sense." "It will." Whitfield pressed his hands flat on the table. He was 22 now in his last semester, and he had developed the capacity for a particular kind of frustration that came from knowing enough to see the shape of a problem, but not enough to see the solution. "And the pile," he said, "we have to clear it. Do you have any idea what it would cost to chip all that wood? We'd have to rent equipment. It would take weeks." Leland finished with the rosewood handle. He set it down on a clean cloth and looked at his grandson. Whitfield had grown into someone he recognized, a young man with his mother's directness and his grandmother's instinct for argument, and a mind that was quick and well-organized and currently pointed in the wrong direction. "The wood has a purpose," Leland said. "It isn't done yet. Be patient." Whitfield stood up from the table. "You always say that." He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame, his back to his grandfather. "What if you're wrong?" Leland did not answer. Whitfield went upstairs. The kitchen was quiet. Leland sat with his coffee and the restored plane handle and the ticking of the clock above the stove. He was not angry. He had never been particularly susceptible to anger. But he understood that something was required now, and that it had to be done quickly and without explanation, because the explanation was the thing that would only become possible afterward. He went to the workshop and made 3 phone calls. One to a young man named Denton Briggs, who lived at the far end of the county road and had helped him with heavy lifting before. One to an equipment rental company. One to a lumberyard in Nashville, a brief conversation about current market pricing for specific species and grades. He wrote figures in the back of the blue notebook after he hung up. Then he went to the barn and began preparing the floor. He had spent the last year acquiring equipment without telling anyone. He had done this not to be secretive, but because the moment for explanation had not arrived, and he was a man who reserved explanation for the moment when the thing being explained was present and visible. The machines were in the barn. The wood was at the fence. The time had come to connect them. Denton Briggs started on the Monday of the final week of October at $15 an hour. They began not at the visible face of the pile, but at the back where the oldest stack stood. 11 years of stickered rows, the most seasoned material in the collection boards that had been breathing and settling and stabilizing since the early days of the arrangement. They moved it with wheelbarrows, piece by piece, load by load, from the fence line into the barn. Leland directed the placement of each stack with the same precision he brought to everything, leaving clear aisles between the rows, positioning the material by species and dimension in the side wings. Whitfield refused to help. He had decided his grandfather had finally reached the point of genuine irrationality, and he was not willing to participate in what looked to him like an old man's stubborn performance of a principle that was costing them both time and money. He went to his classes and came home and ate dinner and said what needed to be said and did not go to the barn. On the 4th day of the clearing work, he came home early. He walked across the yard toward the barn because he needed a tool from the workshop behind it, and the barn was in the way. He passed the side door of the barn, which was ajar, and the light inside was on. He stopped. He looked through the gap in the door. The afternoon light came through the high south windows in long, clean lines and fell across a space that was not what he had imagined. The machines were positioned in the central bay, their cast iron surfaces dark and solid-tuned and ready. The side wings were filling with wood in organized rows, species by species, labeled and dated. It was not a storage shed. It was not a warehouse. It was the material half of something that only lacked the other half to become complete. Whitfield stood at the door for 3 minutes. He went inside. He picked up the far end of a long fir beam that Denton was positioning, and he held it while Denton secured it in place. Nobody said anything. Nobody asked him to explain himself. He simply stayed, and he worked. And when Denton went home at 5, Leland and Whitfield continued until 7, and they drove back to the house in Leland's truck without speaking. And Leland made soup from whatever was in the refrigerator, and they ate it at the kitchen table at Cordelia's table, and the silence was different now from any silence Whitfield could remember between them. It was the silence of two people who are looking at the same thing. October 31st came with a cold, clear sky and the smell of wood smoke in the air. By mid-afternoon, the fence line was clear. Not cleared in the sense of destroyed, not chipped or hauled or disposed of. Moved. Every usable piece of it was now inside the barn, organized and ready. The ground where 11 years of deliveries had accumulated was bare, and even with only the grass impression of where the stacks had stood to indicate that anything had ever been there. From the window of his office, Barnwell Mercer looked at the cleared ground and felt a small, clean satisfaction. The old man had complied. The situation was resolved. He had avoided an unpleasant enforcement action, and the operational irregularity was closed. He made a note to cancel the code enforcement call he had scheduled for the following morning. He crossed the item off his list and moved to the next one. He had no way to see inside the barn. He had no way to know that Leland Pendleton had not cleaned up a pile. He had converted 11 years of patience into a physical inventory that was now housed, sorted, and connected to machinery that could transform it into finished product. He had not surrendered a resource. He had moved it indoors. And in the morning, he was going to bring Barnwell Mercer an envelope. Barnwell Mercer arrived at his office at 7:45 on the morning of November 1st, which was early even by his standards. He had a productive week ahead. The waste disposal contract was being renegotiated with the hauling company, a new efficiency review of the kiln room was scheduled for Thursday, and the cleared ground on the adjacent property had resolved the last outstanding irregularity from his operational audit. He poured his coffee from the machine in the break room and carried it back to his desk and opened his calendar and felt in the clean and organized way he often felt on Monday mornings that the system was working. His secretary knocked at 8:53. "There's a man in reception asking for you," she said. "A Leland Pendleton. He doesn't have an appointment." Mercer looked up from his screen. The name registered with the part of his mind that kept operational files. The neighbor, the property owner, the pile that was now cleared. He had mentally closed that account the previous afternoon. "Send him in," he said. Then after a moment, "Actually, I'll come out." He walked out to the reception area. Leland Pendleton was standing near the door. He wore clean work clothes, the kind a craftsman wears when he is going somewhere that is not the shop but wants to be recognizable for what he is. Dark canvas trousers, a collared shirt, the same leather work boots he had worn for 20 years, resoled twice. His hands were at his sides. He was not holding a complaint or a counter-proposal or a lawyer's letter. He was holding a single cream-colored envelope. Whitfield stood slightly behind him off to one side in the posture of a young man who has agreed to be present without having been told exactly why. "Mr. Mercer," Leland said, "I believe this is in order." He held out the envelope. Mercer took it. The paper was heavy in his hand, a quality he registered without thinking about. He opened it. Inside was one sheet, a single line of text printed in that faint, pressured way of dot matrix output. He read it. He read it again. And then, because he was a man whose instincts operated faster than his discretion, he laughed. Not a large laugh. A short, sharp, involuntary sound, the kind that escapes before you decide to let it. Leland waited. The laugh died. Mercer looked at the paper again, and the expression that replaced the amusement was something more complicated, a mixture of professional offense and the first faint intrusion of a feeling he could not yet name. "This is a joke," he said. "It is not a joke," Leland said. His voice was level in the way that deep water is level, not because nothing is beneath it, but because the surface gives no indication of the depth. "You stated that the wood was waste," Leland continued. "You stated that disposing of it cost your company $1,500 a month. Over 11 years, that is $198,000 in disposal costs that your company did not pay because I received the material and managed it on my property. The figure on that invoice is less than 25% of the money I saved your operation. I consider that a fair rate for 11 years of storage and curation services." Mercer's expression had moved fully away from amusement now. "This is extortion. We had a verbal agreement. We allowed you to take the material at no cost." "We had an agreement that I could use the material," Leland said, "and I have used it." He reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and produced a small key. It was hand-carved from a piece of dark walnut, the head shaped into a simple rectangle, smooth from handling. He held it out toward Mercer. "I would like you to come and see how I've used it." Whitfield, standing near the door, looked at his grandfather's hand and the key in it, and felt the first movement of something in his chest that he did not have a name for yet. Mercer looked at the key. He was a man who made decisions based on data, and the data in front of him was incomplete. The invoice was either the document of a deluded old man or the document of someone who knew something he did not. He needed to know which. 15 minutes, he said. They walked across the parking lot in the November air, 3 men in a line, Leland leading. They went through the gate at the edge of the Precision prefab property across the access road through the gap in the fence that Leland had left for foot traffic. Past the old house with its porch and its winter garden. Past the original workshop where the hand tools hung in their places and the smell of linseed oil reached the door even from outside. And then to the barn. Mercer had seen the barn from the aerial photograph. It had looked at satellite resolution like a large agricultural outbuilding. Nothing remarkable. Standing before it now, he revised his assessment. It was a serious structure, well-proportioned, the siding tight and the roofline true. The kind of building that did not ask for compliments, but earned them. On the front face mounted above the main doors was a sign he had not seen in any photograph. It was a single piece of laminated Douglas fir, 3 feet high and 10 feet long, the surface planed to a gloss, the letters carved into the wood in a classical Roman font, deep and clean, and finished with a dark stain that made them stand out against the pale grain. The sign read Pendleton and Son Custom Millwork. Whitfield, reading the sign, stopped walking. His name was in it, not as an afterthought, not as a future possibility, as a present fact. His grandfather had put his name on the building before telling him what the building was for, which meant he had known for some time what Whitfield's answer was going to be, even during the arguments, even during the weeks of refusal, even when Whitfield had stood at the table and called the whole project irrational. He stood under the sign and said nothing. Leland used the walnut key to open the side door and pushed it wide. The interior was lit by the south-facing windows he had positioned during construction to give working light for most of the day without direct glare. The illumination that came through them on this November morning was pale, and even the quality of light that makes things look like themselves without embellishment. It fell across the central bay of the barn and revealed without drama what Leland Pendleton had been building toward for 11 years. The machinery occupied the central floor in a deliberate arrangement that reflected a sequence of operations. Table saw, jointer planers, band saw, drill press. Each machine was restored to working condition, the cast iron surfaces flat and true, the fences square, the blades sharp. They were not new machines. They bore the marks of age and prior use. But they had been brought back to a standard that their designers would have recognized and positioned in a workflow that a production mill workshop would have paid a consultant to design. To the left and right, filling the side wings from floor to ceiling, was the wood. Not a pile, not a heap, a library. Douglas fire, organized by dimension, the stack labels written in the same hand as the notebook entries. Southern yellow pine, its grain dense and warm-colored in the far right section. Maple in the center of the left wing, separated by board width and thickness. A smaller section of white oak in the back corner pieces, selected over years for clarity of grain and freedom from defect. Every board had been in that barn long enough to have found its equilibrium, to have settled into the stable state that fine work requires. The most seasoned pieces had been air drying for close to a decade. Mercer stepped inside and stopped. He was a man who had spent his professional life walking production floors and warehouses and distribution centers, and he had developed an instinct for the value of material inventory. What he was looking at was not what he had expected. He had expected storage. He was standing in a fully capitalized production facility. Whitfield stepped in behind him. He had been in the barn during the moving work, but he had not seen it like this, fully organized, the machines in place, the wood stacked and labeled, the morning light showing the whole thing clearly. He turned slowly, taking in the side wings, the equipment, the ceiling height, the clear aisles. His accounting mind ran the numbers without being asked to. Material value, equipment value, production capacity, customer base potential for custom millwork in a region with strong residential construction activity. The figure he arrived at was considerably larger than anything he had calculated before, and it was not a theoretical figure. It was sitting in front of him. Leland walked to the workbench along the back wall where the blue notebook was open to a page of calculations. He had done the arithmetic over the previous week using the methodology he had developed over 11 years. I estimated the board footage of every delivery from the beginning, he said. I used your company's annual reports to establish the market price your operation paid for raw lumber stock. I discounted that figure by 50% to account for the smaller dimensions of the offcuts. The number on that invoice represents my cost for receiving, organizing, and curating the material your company delivered to my property across 11 years. You categorized that process as waste disposal. I categorized it as inventory financing. Those are two descriptions of the same transaction. He paused. You can pay the invoice or we can discuss an alternative arrangement. Mercer stood in the center of the room. He held the invoice in one hand. He looked at the number on the page and then he looked at what surrounded him, and the part of his brain that had been trained to assess situations as sets of variables ran the calculation and arrived at an answer he did not like. He had come to this property with leverage. The leverage had been the disposal cost, the code ordinance, the legal weight of a corporation behind a certified letter. He had expected an old man who would eventually comply or capitulate because those were the two outcomes his system recognized. The system had not recognized a third possibility, which was that the old man had been building toward this moment since before Mercer was out of high school. The legal case was not clean. The verbal agreement had permitted Leland to use the material, and he had used it. The invoice was unusual, but it was not nonsensical. A court case would require establishing that the arrangement had produced no value to the company, which was directly contradicted by 11 years of avoided disposal costs. The public dimension was worse. A national manufacturing conglomerate suing a 72-year-old craftsman for cleaning up their industrial waste and turning it into a woodworking business would not play well in any venue he could imagine. He had walked in with the full weight of a corporate legal department behind him. He was standing in a barn that had been built from his company's discarded material, looking at a number that was arguably conservative next to a young man who was clearly calculating the same things he was and arriving at similar conclusions from the other side. The silence in the barn lasted longer than silences usually do. I'll need to speak to our legal team, Mercer said. Of course, Leland said. I'll be here. The meetings happened over the following 3 weeks. They took place in the conference room and at the Precision Prefab facility, a room that smelled of carpet cleaner and recycled air in the particular neutrality of corporate space. The company's attorneys were thorough and professional. They raised the question of the verbal agreement, the question of whether the stored material constituted implicit compensation, the question of applicable statutes. They were doing their jobs. Leland sat across the table with Whitfield beside him. He did not bring an attorney. He brought the notebook, the building permit records, and the same calloused hands that had sorted wood in the cold for 11 years, which he rested on the polished table without apology. He answered questions when they were addressed to him. He did not volunteer information. He did not raise his voice. Whitfield, in the first meeting, found himself watching his grandfather more than the attorneys. Leland's stillness in that room was not the stillness of a man who had nothing to say. It was the stillness of a man who understood that time was running in his direction and that the most powerful thing he could do was wait. He had the wood. He had the machines. He had the contract potential already established by the very existence of the facility next door. He had waited 11 years for a Tuesday morning. He could wait 3 more weeks for a Thursday afternoon. By the second meeting, Whitfield had stopped checking the clock. The settlement was reached on a Thursday. Precision Prefab LLC would pay Pendleton & Son Custom Millwork the sum of $15,000 in full resolution of the invoice claim. Additionally, the company would enter into a 10-year supply agreement under which all wood offcuts generated by the Millhaven facility would be sold to Pendleton & Son at a rate of 10 cents on every dollar of the material's original acquisition cost. The arrangement would be documented, reviewed annually, and formalized under a contract that both parties' legal representatives had approved. Mercer signed the agreement in the conference room with the kind of controlled expression that a man maintains when he is turning a loss into a presentable outcome. He had already drafted his internal report. He would frame it as the conversion of a liability into a revenue stream and the formalization of an undocumented process into an auditable supply relationship. His regional director would accept that framing. It was accurate as far as it went. What it did not describe was the barn and the machines in the 11 years and the man who had sat across the table and waited. The real outcome of the settlement was not the $15,000, though that was real money and Leland put it directly into the business account he had opened the week before. The real outcome was the supply agreement, which gave Pendleton and Son Custom Millwork a permanent and legally protected source of high-grade raw material at a fraction of market cost. The factory next door, which had been the source of everything, would now be a contractual partner rather than an informal arrangement, and the wood would keep coming. Leland drove home from the final meeting in his truck with Whitfield in the passenger seat. The light was going out of the sky to the west, that specific November light that is both fading and very clear, at the same time the kind that makes ordinary things look significant. Whitfield said, "You knew he would come back with a counter." "I thought he might, and you knew we wouldn't get the full amount." "I hoped for more than we got," Leland said, "but I planned for what we got." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the fields along Route 9 were stubbled, and brown the season fully turned. "The agreement is worth more than the invoice anyway," he said. "Yes," Leland said, "it is." This was the first business conversation they had ever completed without Whitfield finding cause to disagree with the premise. He noticed this and he thought it was probably significant, and he stored it in the part of his mind where he kept the things he intended to return to. The sound of the barn changed in December. Where there had been the scrape of wheelbarrows and the thud of lumber being stacked, there was now the high, clean scream of a table saw ripping through Douglas fir, and the lower, steadier voice of the jointer dressing an edge, and the smell of fresh-cut wood that is one of the oldest and best smells a working building can have. Leland brought in their first paying commission that month, a set of kitchen cabinet doors for a house in a neighboring county built from maple that had been seasoning in the barn for 7 years. The client, a contractor who had heard about the new millwork operation through a job site conversation, ran his hand along the finished surface and asked where the wood came from. "Next door," Leland said. The contractor looked through the barn's south window at the precision prefab facility visible beyond the fence line. He nodded slowly, as a man does when he understands a thing he is not sure he entirely believes. Denham Cartwright appeared on a morning in February. He drove his truck up the county road and turned into the Pendleton property without calling ahead, which was his habit and which Leland had always found more honest than the alternative. He got out of the truck and stood in the yard and listened to the sound of the machinery inside the barn and looked at the sign over the door for a long time before he went in. Leland was running a piece of fir through the table saw, Whitfield managing the outfeed. They stopped the machine when Cartwright came in. He stood in the doorway and took in the space the way a professional takes in another professional's workspace, which is to say with attention and without much visible expression. He looked at the side wings. He looked at the machines. He walked to the left wing and stood in front of the maple section and looked at the stack labels. He touched the end grain of one of the boards with his fingertip, reading it the way any experienced woodworker reads end grain. "This came from the factory," he said. "All of it," Leland said. Cartwright was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been putting this together?" 11 years. Something passed across Denholm Cartwright's face. He was closing in on 70 now and had spent 4 decades building a woodworking business through volume and efficiency and competitive pricing, which had been a legitimate and successful strategy in which he believed in. But standing in the barn, looking at the material quality that Leland had assembled through a method that Cartwright had twice called a junkyard operation, he felt the particular discomfort of a man confronted with evidence that someone he had underestimated had been operating at a level he had not perceived. He was not a graceful man, but he was not a dishonest one. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You were working with what you could see," Leland said. "So was I." Cartwright accepted this, which was the only response available to him. He looked at Whitfield, who was standing at the outfeed table with his hands resting on the fence rail. "You taking customers?" Cartwright asked. "We are," Whitfield said. "I've got 2 clients looking for custom millwork. Architectural molding's one of them. Built-in cabinetry the other. Bigger than what I run and not my specialty." He paused. "I could send them your way." Whitfield looked at his grandfather. Leland was already walking back toward the table saw. "Send them over," Whitfield said. Cartwright left the way he had come without ceremony. Whitfield watched his truck pull out of the yard and turn onto the county road, and he felt something settle in the air of the barn that had not been there before. A kind of acknowledgement from the town itself delivered through the medium of a difficult man who had driven over of his own accord. Millhaven understood now what Pendleton and Son was. Waverly Fitch came in the spring of the 2nd year, not with a clipboard and a complaint, but with a kitchen remodel he wanted done. He sat at the workbench with Whitfield, and looked at wood samples and talked about dimensions and finishes with the careful attention of a man who had spent his career thinking about how buildings were put together. When the discussion of materials came up, he ran his hand along a sample of the maple that Whitfield had brought out. "This is from the factory," he asked. "From 2003, Whitfield said. "It's been in the barn since 2011. Fitch was quiet. He set the sample down. "I should have done better by your grandfather," he said, "in 2006, when that complaint came in." Whitfield had thought about this before, and he had arrived at a position he believed was honest. "You did your job," he said, "and because you came out, Grandpa started keeping building records. Those records were part of what made our legal position solid in 2011, so—" He let the sentence end where it was. Fitch looked at him. He was 59 now, and the years of careful, methodical work showed in his face in a way that was not unkind. He knew what he was doing the whole time, he said. It was not quite a question. "I think he knew what he was building," Whitfield said. "I don't think he knew every step of how he'd get there, but he knew where he was going." Fitch ordered the kitchen cabinets. He became a reliable referral source in the county, which turned out to be a more significant contribution than anything he had done with a clipboard. In the last autumn, before Leland's health began its final decline, he and Whitfield sat together one evening in the workshop after the day's work was done. The machines in the barn had gone quiet. The smell of fresh-cut fur still hung in the air. Leland opened the drawer beneath the main workbench and took out the blue notebook, the first one his cover worn soft with years of handling. He set it on the bench between them and opened it to the first page. November 14th, 2000. Approximately 210 board feet. Douglas fir 2x10 and 2x8 mixed lengths. Some plywood 3/4-inch partial sheets. He looked at it for a moment, then slid it across the bench to Whitfield. "I want you to keep this one," he said. Whitfield picked it up. He understood that this was not a gesture about the numbers inside it, though the numbers mattered. It was a gesture about the beginning, about the fact that everything they had built had started on a Tuesday morning with a question simple enough to fit in 20 words and an answer even simpler than that. "Why this one?" Whitfield asked. "Because it will remind you where the first step was," Leland said. He stood and began switching off the workshop lights the way he had done 10,000 times before. "The first step is always the same. You see something worth saving, and you reach for it." Leland Pendleton worked in the mill for 8 more years after the settlement. He was not a man who aged in a way that drew attention to itself. He slowed as men slow incrementally and without announcement. He spent more time at the hand tools and less time running the machines which suited him. He had always preferred the plane to the power equipment, the feel of the blade reading the grain through the handle. He worked in the mornings when the light was best and left the afternoon production to Whitfield, who was faster and stronger, and who had by then absorbed enough of the method to make decisions that Leland trusted. Leland died in the early morning of a March day in his own bed in the house his grandfather had built. He was 80 years old. The doctor said it was his heart, which was a description rather than an explanation, because the heart of a man like Leland Pendleton was not a thing that could be fully accounted for by any single word. He left the house, the 3.2 acres in the mill, to Whitfield. There was not a great deal of money, which had never been the measure of anything in that family. There was the land which had been in the family since 1922, and which Whitfield had no intention of parting with. There were the tools, including his grandfather's Stanley Bailey No. 7, which Whitfield hung on the wall of the workshop in the specific position it had always occupied, and which he took down and used only for the work that deserved it. And there was the business which had 3 employees and clients in 4 counties, and a reputation for material quality that could not be manufactured by any process faster than time. Whitfield runs it today. He is in the barn by 7 most mornings earlier in the busy seasons. He has hired a second millwright and a woman who manages the client relationships and the estimating, which frees him for the floor work he prefers. The supply agreement with Precision Prefab has been renewed twice and now covers a larger volume than the original contract because the facility expanded and its off-cut generation grew accordingly. The wood keeps coming over the fence line, documented and priced and delivered by forklift on a published schedule. Nothing like the informal dumps of the early years, but the same material still arriving, still being received. On the wall of the office they built in the corner of the barn, framed in walnut, is a copy of the invoice. $47,281.50, one line, the ghost ink of dot matrix print on cream paper. Clients occasionally notice it and ask about it. Whitfield has learned to tell the story in about 4 minutes in a way that includes the essential facts without losing the essential feeling, which is something Leland taught him without teaching it by telling it that way himself. Next to the invoice in a smaller frame is the first page of the blue notebook. November 14th, 2000. Approximately 210 board feet. Douglas fir 2x10 and 2x8 mixed lengths. Some plywood 3/4 inch partial sheets. The handwriting is in pencil, precise and unhurried, the handwriting of a man who was beginning something he expected to take a long time. There is a moment that Whitfield returns to not often, but with some regularity, when the work is quiet and the light in the barn has that particular quality that the south windows make in winter. It is not a dramatic moment. It does not belong to the invoice or the negotiation or the day the barn doors opened. It is a window at 2 in the morning and a work light on a post and an old man sorting wood in the February cold, because that was the one thing he could do when the world had taken the person he most needed, and doing it was enough to make the morning possible. That is the image Whitfield carries. Not the victory, not the invoice on the wall. The man at the fence in the dark, working patient, refusing to let grief be the last word. The men who built this country with their hands understood something that the men who measure it with spreadsheets have always struggled to account for. They understood that the most valuable things are not the things that can be quickly converted into cash. They are the things that take long enough to build that they outlast the person who built them. A chest of drawers that 3 generations of one family have opened every morning. A barn that stands because the man who built it checked every joint twice. A business whose foundation is not capital, but character, not investment, but the slow, daily, unremarkable decision to do the work right and do it again tomorrow. Leland Pendleton did not set out to defeat a corporation. He set out to not waste good wood. The corporation came to him as all the things that tried to stop him on and found that there was nothing there to stop. Only a man doing what he had always done with material he had always valued toward a purpose he had always understood, even on the mornings when no one else could see it yet. The notebook that started on a November afternoon in the year 2000 sits in the office of Pendleton and Son Custom Millwork. Whitfield has filled 4 more since then, the same format, the same pencil entries, dates, and species and footage. He does not keep them for any practical reason at this point. He keeps them because they are the record of something, and his grandfather showed him across 11 years of quiet work that what you write down outlasts what you remember. What a company calls waste is often just a resource observed without patience. And patience, unlike lumber, is a resource that does not diminish with use. It compounds.